The war was winning. At least that is what the map said. Across Europe, colored arrows pushed forward inch by inch. Enemy lines bent, then broke. Cities that had once seemed unreachable were now within grasp. The sound of artillery rolled eastward, and with every passing week the end of the war felt closer. And yet, inside the rooms where decisions were made, there was fear. Not fear of the enemy alone, but fear of a man wearing the same uniform. A man whose victories came too fast. A man whose confidence burned too brightly. A man whose name inspired both awe and quiet alarm. General Georges Patton. To the soldiers under his command he was a force of nature. Loud, relentless, demanding, and unforgettable. He moved faster than anyone else, struck harder than expected, and seemed to understand war as something alive, something to be chased, cornered, and destroyed. But to the Allied High Command, Patton was something else entirely. He was a problem. Not because he failed, but because he succeeded in ways they could not fully control. Behind closed doors, far from the cheers of liberated towns and triumphant headlines, the most powerful military leaders of the Second World War asked a dangerous question. What if this man could not be trusted? Perhaps this was where it all began. Not on a battlefield but in a quiet room. Not with gunfire but with doubt. War, at its highest level, is not only about courage and firepower. It is about balance, about patience, about keeping many fragile parts from tearing each other apart. And by 1942, the Allied war effort was exactly that, fragile. The alliance that fought Nazi Germany was not built on friendship. It was built on necessity. Britain, America, and their partners did not share a single vision of the world. They shared a single enemy. Every major decision required compromise. Every move had to be weighed not just for military success, but for political fallout, public reaction, and long-term stability. In this world, restraint mattered. Patton did not believe in restraint. He believed in motion. To understand why the Allied High Command never fully trusted him, we must first understand the kind of war they were fighting, and the kind of man Patton believed himself to be. The Second World War was not like the wars that came before it. It was not fought by isolated armies meeting on open fields. It was global, industrial, and deeply political. Every bomb dropped echoed in newspapers. Every decision was watched by allies and enemies alike. Commanders were no longer just generals. They were symbols. A mistake could cost more than lives. It could cost trust between nations. And Patton was a man who made people nervous. He spoke in absolutes. He glorified violence. He believed fear was a tool, not a weakness. His speeches were filled with blood, steel, and destiny. To his troops it was motivating. To politicians and planners it was terrifying. Because modern war demanded control, and Patton embodied chaos. Even before American forces fully entered the war, Patton had already built a reputation. He was brilliant but difficult, intelligent but impulsive, obsessed with history, yet convinced he was meant to reshape it. He did not see himself as a small part of a massive machine. He saw himself as the engine. And engines, when pushed too hard, can explode. When the United States entered the war, it did so cautiously. Its army was large but untested. Its commanders were skilled but aware of their limits. They studied, planned, and prepared. Every mistake was examined. Every failure analyzed. Patton had little patience for this. He believed war rewarded speed, not caution. He believed hesitation was deadlier than error. And most dangerously, he believed he was right. At first, his superiors tolerated this, even admired it, because when Patton fought, he won. In North Africa, where American forces faced German troops for the first time, confidence was low. Early encounters exposed weaknesses. Morale suffered. The enemy seemed sharper, faster, more experienced. Then Patton arrived. He brought order through fear, discipline through pressure, and momentum through sheer force of will. Units that had stumbled suddenly moved with purpose. Command posts buzzed with energy. Soldiers straightened their uniforms, cleaned their weapons, and stood taller. Patton demanded perfection, and punished failure. The results were undeniable. Victories followed. Positions were taken. The tide turned. And yet, even as reports praised his effectiveness, something darker began to surface. Patton did not simply command. He dominated. He ignored advice. He challenged authority. He spoke openly, too openly, about his contempt for weakness, hesitation, and compromise. To his mind, war was simple. Kill the enemy faster than they can kill you. But to the Allied High Command, war was anything but simple. They had to think beyond the battlefield. They had to consider civilian populations, international opinion, and the delicate balance between allies who did not always trust one another. Patton's words, his actions, his very presence threatened that balance. And then came Sicily. The campaign was meant to be a coordinated effort, carefully timed landings, synchronized advances, and a unified front. Instead, it became a race. Patton pushed his army beyond assigned boundaries. He competed with fellow commanders. He chased glory with relentless hunger. He succeeded. Cities fell faster than expected. German and Italian forces retreated. Headlines celebrated his drive and daring. But inside Allied headquarters, concern grew. Because Patton was no longer just winning battles. He was embarrassing other leaders. Undermining unity. Turning a shared mission into a personal contest. And worse still, he did something unforgivable. In a hospital ward, far from the front lines, Patton encountered soldiers suffering from what we now recognize as combat trauma. Men broken by constant fear, exhaustion, and loss. Patton saw weakness. He shouted. He struck. He accused wounded men of cowardice. When word reached senior leadership, it was not just outrage they felt. It was fear. Fear of public backlash. Fear of moral collapse. Fear that one man's worldview could damage everything they were trying to build. From that moment on, trust shattered. Patton was no longer just a general. He was a risk. A weapon too powerful to leave unsupervised. And so, quietly, without headlines or announcements, the Allied High Command made a choice. They would use Patton. But they would never fully trust him. They would exploit his reputation, his aggression, his brilliance, while keeping him at arm's length. Watching. Limiting. Containing. Patton sensed it. He felt the leash tighten. He raged against it. He believed destiny was being denied. But destiny, like war itself, answers to no one. And as the greatest invasion in human history approached, the Allies would commit their most ironic act. They would place Patton at the center of a grand deception. Not to lead the main attack, but to fool the enemy. Because even Germany feared him. And fear in war can be more powerful than truth. This was the paradox of George S. Patton. Too dangerous to trust. Too valuable to discard. Too human to control. And the deeper the war went, the clearer it became. The Allies were not afraid Patton would lose. They were afraid of what he might do if he won. The war widened like a spreading fire. From the deserts of North Africa to the skies over Europe, the Allied war machine was growing larger, louder, and more complex with each passing month. Ships crossed oceans without pause. Factories worked through the night. New soldiers arrived every day, young men carrying rifles heavier than their fears, stepping into a conflict that had already consumed millions. At the center of this storm sat the Allied High Command. They were not warriors in the traditional sense. They were planners, coordinators, negotiators. Men who spent long nights bent over maps, listening to radio reports crackle with static and bad news. Men who understood that victory would not come from a single charge or a single hero, but from careful timing, cooperation, and restraint. They lived in a world of patience. And patience was something George Patton never learned to love. Patton believed war rewarded boldness. He studied ancient generals, read about cavalry charges and sweeping maneuvers, and imagined himself as part of a long line of warriors stretching back through history. He spoke of reincarnation, of having fought in past wars, of destiny calling him again and again to the battlefield. To some, this made him inspiring. To others, it made him unsettling. The Allied High Command had seen men like Patton before. Commanders who burned brightly then burned out. Leaders who confused courage with recklessness. Men whose hunger for action blinded them to consequences. And yet, every time they tried to pull Patton back, the battlefield answered for him. He moved faster than expected. He struck where others hesitated. He turned confusion into momentum. Soldiers followed him because he seemed to know where the war was going, and how to get there before anyone else. This created a dangerous imbalance. In a coalition war, no single commander could be allowed to dominate the narrative. British leaders worried about American arrogance. American leaders worried about British caution. Smaller Allied nations worried about being ignored entirely. Unity was fragile. Patton threatened that unity without even trying. He spoke carelessly. He insulted allies. He criticized strategy in public. He dismissed political concerns as distractions from the real war. To Patton, there was only one measure of success: advance. But war is never that simple. As preparations began for the invasion of Europe, the tension surrounding Patton deepened. This was not just another campaign. This would be the largest amphibious assault in history. Hundreds of thousands of men. Thousands of ships. Absolute secrecy. Any mistake could doom the operation. Any loose word could cost tens of thousands of lives. and Patton was known for loose words. So the Allied High Command made another quiet decision. They would keep him visible but inactive. Patton was placed in charge of a fictional army. Inflatable tanks. Fake radio traffic. Phantom divisions that existed only to deceive German intelligence. The enemy watched Patton closely, convinced he would lead the main invasion. And that belief was encouraged. Patton became the centerpiece of the greatest deception operation of the war. To the public he appeared sidelined. To the Germans he was the coming storm. To Allied planners he was bait. This was the ultimate irony. The general they did not trust was the one the enemy feared most. And so Patton waited. He paced headquarters. He studied maps. He raged in private. He felt humiliated, convinced he was being punished for telling hard truths. Perhaps he was. But from the Allied perspective, this was not punishment. It was containment. They had learned something crucial. Patton was at his best when unleashed, and at his worst when restrained. And yet, total freedom was impossible. The war had grown too big, too interconnected, too fragile. Eventually, necessity won. When Allied forces broke out of Normandy and needed speed, real speed, Patton was released. What followed was breathtaking. His army surged across France. Supply lines stretched thin. Enemy forces collapsed under relentless pressure. Patton pushed forward when others paused. He exploited gaps with instinctive precision. Once again he delivered results no one else could. And once again the fear returned. Because Patton did not slow down. He demanded fuel, supplies, reinforcements, and expected them immediately. He criticized cautious commanders. He pressured leadership to prioritize his advance above all others. From his perspective, the path to victory was clear. From theirs, it was dangerously narrow. They saw the risks he ignored. Overextended units. Vulnerable flanks. Political consequences of reckless destruction. Civilian suffering that could harden resistance instead of breaking it. Patton was winning battles. But war is not won on battlefields alone. The Allied High Command never doubted Patton's courage. They never doubted his skill. They doubted his judgment. And judgment in modern war mattered more than bravery. As the war neared its end, Patton grew more outspoken, not less. He spoke about the future of Europe, about enemies and allies in ways that unsettled politicians. He questioned post-war plans. He voiced opinions that clashed with diplomatic realities. To the men planning peace he sounded like a threat to it. And so the distance remained. Patton finished the war celebrated by soldiers, admired by historians, and quietly distrusted by those who had held the greatest responsibility. Because they had seen something others missed. They had seen how close brilliance can come to disaster. They had seen how a single personality, unchecked, could fracture alliances and derail strategy. They understood that winning the war required more than courage. It required restraint. Patton never fully accepted that. Perhaps that is why his legacy remains so powerful, that he represents something ancient. The warrior spirit. The belief that strength and will can overcome any obstacle. That destiny favors the bold. But the war he fought was modern. It demanded cooperation over conquest. Planning over impulse. Silence over speeches. And in that world, Patton would always stand slightly apart. Not rejected. Not embraced. But watched. Used. And never fully trusted. Because the Allies were not afraid of Patton's enemies. They were afraid of what war could become if men like Patton were allowed to shape it alone. And perhaps that fear, more than any battle, defined the way the war was won. For all his victories, George Patton was a lonely man. Not lonely in the way soldiers feel loneliness in foxholes, surrounded by noise and danger. Patton's loneliness was quieter, deeper. It lived in the space between applause and silence, between orders given and trust withheld. He could feel it. Every reassignment. Every delay. Every polite but distant conversation with senior leaders. He sensed that something stood between him and complete acceptance. And the more he sensed it, the harder he pushed. Patton believed pressure revealed truth. So he applied pressure to everyone, his men, his officers, himself. He slept little. He thought constantly. He carried notebooks filled with observations, quotes, and fragments of thought. He believed history was watching him, measuring him, waiting to judge whether he was worthy of remembrance. This belief fueled him. And it haunted him. Patton did not fight the war simply to defeat Germany. He fought it to prove something, to himself, and to the ghosts of great commanders he admired. Alexander, Caesar, Napoleon. He wanted motion, triumph, decisive action. But modern war denied him that purity. Behind every order he received were committees, political leaders, Allied sensitivities, newspapers, public opinion, long-term consequences that stretched far beyond the next hill or river crossing. To Patton this felt like chains. He respected hierarchy but only when it moved fast enough for him. When it did not, he felt betrayed. This inner conflict became sharper as the war went on. In private moments, Patton questioned himself. His diaries reveal flashes of doubt, frustration, even sadness. He worried that history would misunderstand him, that his flaws would overshadow his achievements. And perhaps most painfully, he worried that the war would end before he had proven everything he believed about himself. This urgency made him dangerous. The Allied High Command understood something Patton could not. They understood that war is also about endings. Not just how to fight but how to stop fighting. As victory approached, the shape of the world after the war mattered more and more. Borders would shift. Governments would fall. New tensions would rise. Patton spoke openly about future enemies. About unfinished struggles. About strength as the only language nations truly understand. To political leaders these words sounded reckless. They had spent years trying to hold an alliance together. They feared that men like Patton, if given too much influence, could turn victory into endless conflict. So they listened to him. They respected him. But they did not empower him beyond limits. Patton felt this deeply. He wrote of feeling sidelined. Of being misunderstood. Of being used and then restrained. He saw himself as a sword kept in its sheath until the moment of crisis. Sharp, necessary but never trusted to rest freely. And yet, when crisis came they always reached for him. This contradiction defined his war. When Allied forces stalled, Patton surged forward. When momentum faded he restored it. When speed mattered most he delivered it. Each success reinforced his belief that caution was weakness. Each restriction reinforced leadership's belief that he could not be left alone. This cycle never broke. Even at the war's end, as Germany collapsed and celebrations filled the streets, Patton's words caused concern. His blunt statements clashed with the careful language of diplomacy. His frustration with occupation duties was obvious. He wanted motion, not administration. Peace bored him. And peace frightened those responsible for shaping it. The Allied High Command knew that history often treats men like Patton kindly. It remembers victories. It celebrates boldness. It forgets near misses and quiet disasters avoided through restraint. But they lived with the weight of those possibilities. They had seen how quickly words could inflame. How easily alliances could fracture. How thin the line was between order and chaos. Patton walked that line every day. In the end, the Allies won the war not by choosing one approach, but by balancing many. They needed Patton's fire, but not unchecked. They needed planners and diplomats, but not without warriors. The tension between these forces shaped the outcome of the war as surely as any battle. Patton's story is not a story of betrayal, nor of misunderstanding alone. It is a story of limits. The limits of individual brilliance in a collective struggle. The limits of ego in a world shaped by politics. The limits of old ideas of warfare in a modern age. Perhaps this is why his legacy remains unsettled. He is remembered as a hero and as a warning. A reminder that courage without restraint can become recklessness. That speed without coordination can become danger. That winning battles is not the same as winning peace. And yet, without men like Patton, the war might have dragged on longer. Cost more lives. Ended differently. This is the uncomfortable truth. The Allies did not distrust Patton because he was weak. They distrusted him because he was strong. Too strong to ignore. Too unpredictable to fully trust. Too human to fit neatly into the careful machinery of modern war. As time passed and the world moved on, Patton's voice faded. His armies disbanded. His maps were folded away. But the questions he raised never disappeared. How much freedom should leaders have? When does confidence become danger? Where is the line between genius and liability? These questions do not belong to the past. They echo in every age where power and personality collide. Perhaps that is why George Patton still matters. Not because of the ground he conquered, but because of the restraint placed upon him. Because sometimes the most important decisions in history are not about who to trust completely, but who to hold back even when they are winning. And in that quiet act of restraint, the Allies revealed a deeper understanding of war. Not as a contest of heroes, but as a fragile human effort to survive, together. In the end, history often prefers simple stories. Heroes and villains. Victories and defeats. Clear lines between right and wrong. Strong men leading from the front, shaping the world through force of will. But the truth of George Patton does not fit easily into that shape. His story lives in the space between admiration and caution. between success and fear, between what a man can do and what he should be allowed to do. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe, the world exhaled. Cities lay broken, families torn apart, and entire nations searched for meaning in the ruins. The war had demanded everything. And now it demanded something harder. Control. The Allies had won not because of one general or one army or one moment of brilliance. They won because they learned how to manage difference. How to balance aggression with patience. How to hold together an alliance built on tension, compromise, and constant negotiation. Patton did not belong naturally in that world. He belonged to motion. To advance. To the sharp clarity of battle where decisions were made in seconds, not months. Where right and wrong were defined by survival. The Allied High Command understood something painful but necessary. If they allowed men like Patton to define the future alone, the war might never truly end. So they chose caution over celebration. Balance over brilliance. Restraint over impulse. They trusted Patton with armies. They trusted him with battles. They never trusted him with the whole war. And perhaps that was wisdom. Patton's legacy remains powerful because it is unresolved. He stands as proof that greatness is rarely comfortable. That extraordinary ability often arrives paired with extraordinary risk. We still admire his courage. We still study his tactics. We still feel the pull of his confidence and clarity. But we also inherit the lesson learned by those who stood above him. That leadership is not only about strength. It is about responsibility. Not only about winning today but about protecting tomorrow. In every age there are figures like Patton. Brilliant, driven, unstoppable. They promise speed when the world feels slow. Certainty when the world feels unsure. And in every age there are moments when such figures must be guided, not because they are wrong but because they are human. George Patton was never fully trusted because war had outgrown the kind of certainty he offered. The modern world demanded something else. And in choosing to hold him back even while using his strength, the Allies revealed a deeper truth about power itself. That the most dangerous force is not weakness. It is unchecked belief. Belief in oneself. Belief in destiny. Belief that winning excuses everything. Patton believed in all of these. And the world he fought in could not afford to. So his story ends not with a final charge or a single defining moment, but with a quiet understanding. That sometimes the fate of millions depends not on the strongest voice, but on the wisdom to say no even to a hero. And that may be the most important victory of all.